Hey, folks, thanks for joining me. I wanted to bring you this story for a few reasons. First, it illustrates that for some people in this world, the ends justify the means, no matter the means. And in this particular case, we're going to see that the means were nothing short of criminal and, quite frankly, borderline psychopathic. Secondly, it's a great example of, if you're politically connected and well-moneyed, just what you can get away with. And as we see at the very end, I'll show you that in this case, there will be no accountability. So let me start out by introducing you to the Sackler family.
Mikey, Ricky, Danny, Terry, Mikey, Davey, Timmy, Tommy, Joey, Robbie, Johnny, and Brian.
So the Sacklers: Richard, Beverly, David, Eileen, Jonathan, Kathy, Mortimer, and Teresa. So for those who are completely unaware of who Purdue Pharmaceutical is, who the Sackler family is, and what this case is even about, I figured I would just jump about a third of the way through this document and read two paragraphs. 8 people in a single family made the choices that caused much of the opioid epidemic. The Sackler family owns Purdue, and they also held a majority of the seats on its board. Because they controlled their own privately held drug company, the Sacklers had the power to decide how addictive narcotics were sold. They hired hundreds of workers to carry out their wishes, and they fired those who didn't sell enough drugs. They got more patients on opioids at higher doses for longer than ever before. They paid themselves billions of dollars. They are responsible for addiction, overdose, and the death that damaged millions of lives. They should be held accountable now. The misconduct of Richard, Beverly, Eileen, Jonathan, Kathy, Mortimer, and Teresa was particularly unfair, deceptive, and unreasonable, and unlawful because they already had been given a second choice. And here's the kicker. From the 1990s until 2007, they directed a decade of misconduct, which led to criminal convictions, a judgment of this court, and commitments that Purdue would not deceive doctors and patients again. That background confirms that their misconduct since 2007 was knowing and intentional. So that should give you a pretty good idea of who we're dealing with. A family full of criminals, drug dealers, and sociopaths who have no regard for life. And as we scroll up here, I want you to keep in mind, too, that we're talking about one privately held pharmaceutical company owned by one family. Multiply that number by 3 or 6, and we begin to understand why we have an epidemic when it comes to adverse effects to pharmaceuticals. So as you can see, this document, a full 2 weeks ago, hit the desk of Michael Joseph Donovan, the clerk magistrate. It was submitted by Maura Healey, the Attorney General, acting on behalf of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And in it, it lists the entire list of the defendants. We have the Purdue Pharma Limited Partnership, as well as Incorporated, the aforementioned Sackler family, as well as 9 other co-defendants consisting of both past and present board executives. Also, I want you to keep in mind that another reason I'm covering the story is I feel as though it gives great insight into the internal operations of the industry as a whole. This is not unique to Purdue Pharmaceutical or the Sackler family. This is business as usual within the pharmaceutical industry. So rather than me reading from the document line by line, paragraph by paragraph, because quite frankly, this story is not breaking news. We've grown so accustomed to the deception and the lies peddled by these pharmaceutical companies that we've simply come to accept it. It's a bit of a sad statement, really, into just how conditioned we've become. In the case of Purdue Pharma, the main element of criminality revolves around deception. Who was deceived? As you'll see, they targeted anyone and everyone, including their own sales reps and doctors, a point I'd like you to keep in mind. Their primary patient targets were those who had never been prescribed opiates. The term they used was opiate naive. They also targeted veterans and the elderly because of their Medicare D plans. The methods they used to legitimize their lies should come as no surprise. They created a webpage called In the Face of Pain. They self-published pamphlets and books, in particular a book specifically targeting veterans by the catchy title, Exit Wounds, a survival guide for returning veterans and their families. They sponsored luncheons and seminars in which they deliberately misrepresented the efficacy of their line of opioids in the treatment of both rheumatoid and osteoarthritis, a demographic market, by the way, that is 20 million strong and counting. Recall that from the 90s until 2007, they engaged in exactly this sort of behavior. And do you know what happened then? And do you know what's going to happen now? A fine that amounts to mere petty cash for them. No one individual will be held accountable. So in short, that's the who and the how and the when. If you really need to ask why, I imagine the Sacklers can give you 14 billion reasons why. But before we go, I want to leave you guys with a question. As I was reading through the document, the one thing that stood out at me is, at what point should the sales reps and the doctors be held just as responsible as the executives? Anyway, there's a link to the document in the description. I urge you to read it. The latter half is mostly redacted, it's somewhat large print, and it's double-spaced. I'll leave it at that. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and share it, and push that subscribe button. Thanks a lot.